Hello everyone. So this is lecture 20 of Global Ecology and Soil Systems, and today I'm continuing on explaining some of those topics in global ecology first that are related to drawing or explaining topics that can be illustrated easily on my little board and that you can also draw in your exam paper if you're asked some of these questions. And so lecture 6 is the next one. Lecture 5 was more practical about the island biogeography theory. So here, lecture 6, we started speaking about the succession, and we said that there are two types of succession. There will be primary and secondary succession. So primary succession is primary because it's the first stage of succession at all. It's about development of an ecosystem from zero, or the development at all of any kind of form of like specific life, including things like forests, from material of rocks. So in this case, we're speaking about those kinds of examples that were related to like volcanic activity or sand dunes. So how sand was the parent material where first grass and so on later on trees such as pine or other conifers could develop and grow. But most of all, we're speaking about the glacial retreat. So the glacial retreat would mean there was a kind of glacier, and here we have the ice, and by time this would be melting. So some of the surface that was originally covered by ice over there would be exposed to sunshine, and pollen, seeds and so on could reach the surface as well. So in this case, the till material will be the basis of soil development, and that will be the surface where different plant species in the first place could develop. And of course, by time, if the ice would be melting, the glacier would be retreating. So that would mean something like up the valley, that direction. More and more developed or advanced forms of life could be developing on the lower sections of this valley. So in this case, primary succession, then we're speaking first of till on the surface, which we said will mainly be like sand, rocks, pebbles, so different kinds of sedimental material. And then we would have some of these more like pioneers. So pioneers, including things like lichens. Lichens are going to be interesting because they would be, if we have a rock developing by time from something very small, so they would be developing in a circular shape. And by measuring the basically radius or the diameter of the lichen on the rock, we would be able to say how old the lichen is by knowing its development speed, growth rate, and that way we can say approximately how many years it actually took for the lichen to develop, for how long the surface has been exposed to the sunshine at all, or been on the surface and not been covered by ice. So that is lichens, and this method is lichenometry. The method of measuring the size of the lichens and coming up with an estimation of the age of the rock surface. Now we also need to know another method that is often used when speaking about primary succession, and that is the chronosequencing. There you go, chronosequencing. Chrono would mean time in Latin language, and sequencing would be looking at the stages of how, like, time-wise development happened. So that is what we'll be talking about here more in details. It's basically the method of chronosequencing. And what this would involve then is not only speaking about lichens, but more pioneers such as the Dryas. And this I write here with capital D because it's going to be a species name, or at least a genus. And then another pioneer species that we would identify in this case in primary succession in case of glacial retreat would be things like willow, and alder. So what are these? These are not grasses anymore. These are already trees. But these two trees would have quite a fast growth rate. They're relatively weak, easy to break, and so on. So they're only having a relatively short life cycle. And then, opposed to pioneer species, you would have the climax species, which would be first spruce, and then later on the hemlock, so these two tree species would be what we call the climax. So we had a little drawing where we could include these. Of course there would be a number of other species which we could add, but just to simplify the story here, then we said that first the lichens would appear, but very soon after lichens are on the surface, the development of the soil would start to happen, and then things like the Dryas would come to the surface. So how can we draw this in terms of development? Well, this is the horizontal axis showing time, and then we can also think here in this little chart vertical axis that would include, in this case, the biomass, which would mean how much of plant material are we talking about at all. And then we had these different species, different types of plants forms of life dominating the area for certain times or periods in time. And so we could first say that there would be a moment in time when we have many lichens, but that doesn't last long. Maybe it's just a couple of years where we had lichens. And in terms of biomass, it's very low. Lichens are really tiny. So we might also say that soon after that, again, just a couple of years, we're speaking about when things like the dryas, so small like flowers, would be appearing and being on the surface. But again, this is very low in terms of the biomass, so it's really difficult, hardly possible to put it here on this chart. After the dryas has appeared, two species will start to take over, and that will be alder and willow. In terms of the biomass, it would be more of the alder that would be present here and less of the willow. And these would be having a kind of peak in their role in this biomass around 80 years. When they become dominant here. And from that time onwards, their number will be, or biomass rate will be decreasing. And at the same time, we might say it's around this kind of 80 years period when really the spruce will take over. And if we think about how this kind of sequence would continue on, the hemlock will be developing at a kind of a period of like 100 or 120 years after the surface was exposed to sunshine for the first time. So then we can add here another species, the hemlock, which will truly be acting like or as a climax species. And then mainly a forest here in like places such as Canada or boreal forests here we speak about in Siberia as well, would mainly be covered by things like hemlock and spruce, and only those areas that were recently exposed to sunshine would be covered by willow or alder. If we also think about like really the mountain tops, so in this case when glaciers have already melted, it's only where the rock surface really is available where we would have lichens and dryas as well. So that was primary succession mainly here that we need to know about.